The following presentation is a gift from the team at Streamline Publishing, publishers of Fine Art Connoisseur, Plein Air Magazine, and weekly newsletters Fine Art Today, Realism Today, Plein Air Today, and American Watercolor, and events, the Plein Air Convention and the Figurative Art Convention. We offer over 400 different art instruction tutorials and ultra high-quality video by the world's leading artists. If you like what you see, help us support our artists and our team with your purchase. Each video aired has a special discount code for today only in the comments section with a link to the video offered. And to see everything we do, or if you want to receive notice of new releases, new products, and new events for artists, simply click the other link, which says, "See everything we do." Thank you.
Hi, I'm Eric Rhodes, publisher of Fine Art Connoisseur and Plein Air Magazine. Today you're going to meet the lady who started it all, the lady who had this vision for putting art instruction on video so people who couldn't attend workshops could still get the instruction. And this is one of the videos that she produced. It's called Drawing for Painters #2. Enjoy.
Welcome to Illuminations, a program of study designed to guide you through the basic tools one needs to become a better painter. We intend to shed light on the theories, tools, and techniques that provide this foundation. Many of the subjects we'll explore seem to confuse even experienced painters when they're trying to do everything at once. Every stroke applied to a painting must exhibit the knowledge of composition, color, value, edge, linear, and aerial perspective. That's a tall order for a beginner, yet that's exactly what many try to do when they start painting. Actually, all these concepts are simple to understand when they're studied out of the context of trying to execute a painting. Join me for the entire Illumination series for a good basic introduction to the theories, tools, methods, and techniques every painter can use. In this program, we are continuing the study of drawing as it is used by the painter, with the ultimate goal of learning how much of what we think is painting theory is really drawing theory. In another video in the Illumination series entitled Drawing 1 for Painters, we studied drawing concepts as they relate to the landscape. We'll return to landscape later in this program when we discuss composition. But for an in-depth look at what the painter needs to know about landscape subjects, refer to Drawing 1 for Painters. Today our subject is divided into two distinct parts. First, we'll explore the terms, tools, and techniques used in still life drawing, the four basic shapes that make up complex objects, how to create the illusion of a three-dimensional object on a two-dimensional surface, perspective in still life, lighting scenarios for the still life setup, cast shadows, simultaneous contrast, and positive and negative shapes. Then, the second segment will explore the elements of composition and design as they relate to both still life and landscape, by taking a close look at what is meant by viewpoint, balance, variety, repetition, rhythm, scale, contrast, unity, dominance, and the golden mean. That's a pretty ambitious list, but the concepts are really pretty simple. And finally, I'll show you a couple of ways to practice composing with exercises that will stimulate your imagination and creativity, so that you'll never again be stuck without an idea to paint. Let's examine our drawing tools and see what their advantages and disadvantages are. Charcoal is easily manipulated and can give you large, complete drawings in a short period of time, but it's a very dirty medium to use. In the studio, however, that can be overcome with frequent hand washing. An advantage is that you're able to create a wide range of values with a single piece of soft compressed charcoal. To do this most easily, you should choose a large piece, either round or square, with smooth, flat edges that you can use to make broad strokes. The paper always represents the lightest value, unless you also keep a stick of white pastel handy for specific small highlights. How much pressure is applied, or number of strokes in the same area, will determine how dark a value is laid down. Obviously, you can see that the charcoal is really a pretty dirty medium to work with. Pencil is a cleaner medium and more portable. For doing quick sketches on location, when you're in a hurry and don't have time to set up and paint, you can accomplish a great deal with a small drawing pad and a soft 2B school pencil. Drawing tools everyone has at hand. I like to use a pencil that has no wood casing and is made entirely of graphite. I can use it on its point or on its side, just like the soft charcoal. It's a bit dirtier to use this way because the graphite will get on your hands, but a wet travel tissue can be all the cleanup you need. I like a soft 6B pencil that makes really dense, dark values without pressing too hard on the paper. Paint is a good drawing medium for these demonstrations because you'll see not only how value plays a role, but also how to apply paint at the same time you're drawing. Many painters combine drawing and painting, so it's almost impossible for the beginner to distinguish which elements are drawing and which are painting. That's the reason for my using paint in this program. Using only black and white to make the various values, it will become obvious that most painting considerations are really drawing decisions. Color is the only element present in painting that is not present in drawing. Once we solve the problems related to drawing, then the rest doesn't seem so overwhelming. Brush mixing between black and white to produce a range of values between them is a haphazard way of going about a very delicate process. I have mixed with the palette knife 8 values of gray between black and white, for a total of 10 discrete values. Of course, there are an infinite number of values between each adjacent pair of values, but the untrained human eye can't differentiate differences smaller than these. Even skilled painters can hardly distinguish 20 discrete values. I'll be referring to the values I use in the demonstrations by their numbers, so you can become familiar with them. You can use the printed value scale contained in your video case to mix and compare values. The numbered values relate to the following verbal descriptions. 1 equals black. 2 equals dark. Value 3 equals half dark. Value 4, medium dark. Value 5 is medium. Value 6, medium light. Value 7, half light. Value 8, light. Value 9, highlight. And value 10 equals white. You can see why a verbal description might be hard to understand. What exactly is the difference between medium dark and half dark if you don't know the value rating in numbers? Rather than using words as descriptors, value numbers are specific and measurable. It's rather like trying to describe how cold it is in words without using a numbered temperature rating like 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Numbers are specific. Learn them and use them. Once you learn the value ratings of the paint colors you use on your palette, you'll be able to use color more effectively. For instance, cadmium yellow light is value 8 right out of the tube. Cadmium red light is value 5, and ultramarine blue is value 2. If you want to know the exact values of your palette of colors, take a black and white photo of flattened color swatches of each color and compare them when they appear as shades of gray. Often, color distorts our perception of value, and it's important to know what value a pure color is because of how its use will affect our drawings of three-dimensional shapes. In most of the still life demonstrations, I've chosen light, white, or colorless objects to eliminate the confusion that color introduces into the study of value. This allows me to show you the entire range of values that occur in any given setup. You may work along with me using any of the three tools I've shown you: charcoal, pencil, or paint. If you're using paint, I recommend that you tone your surface with a light wash of black thinned with turpentine and allow it to completely dry before using it. This gives you an immediate contrast in value if you need to indicate something with pure white. Without a toned surface, it's hard to see the effect. The draftsman, who is drawing as an end in itself, is very concerned with the line and the qualities that a line can represent. As painters, we use line very little except to initially divide the space on the canvas into its great masses. The line is useful right now, however, to describe the flat shapes that are basic to almost every conceivable form. These shapes are the circle, the triangle, the rectangle, and the square. The circle, as defined by line, appears to have an edge like that of a coin or a disc. When the circle is converted into a sphere, however, we'll see that no edge exists. A sphere has a continuous surface that either advances toward or recedes from the viewer. So how do we represent the sphere in drawing or painting to make it distinct from the disc? Look at how each reacts when lit by a single light source. We've turned off the video lights in the studio to show what this would look like in a painting situation you might set up in your own studio. The disc is almost uniformly lit with little variation across its flat surface. The sphere, however, exhibits a predictable range of values that can be learned as a rule that you can apply most any time you encounter a spherical shape in painting. The normal distribution of values on the surface of a sphere will look like this. The lightest area on the surface is that closest to the light source. Let's assume the light is in the upper left, in front of the sphere. As the surface curves away from the light, it receives the light at a more oblique angle, and therefore can't reflect as much light back toward the viewer. So we perceive those turning, receding surfaces as slightly darker in value than the highlight area. The amount of change from highlight to light on a white object is not very great, but there is a subtle shift that you have to indicate. With the sphere, There comes a point where the light no longer strikes the surface and the plane falls into shadow. On the sphere, the darkest part of the shadow is next to the point where the direct light ends. A remarkable characteristic of the sphere is that after you move away from this core shadow, the value on the shadow side of the sphere gets lighter. Why? Because the surface is picking up reflected light from the tabletop, which is also being illuminated by the light source. This light can be confusing sometimes, seeming to be much lighter than it really is, due to all the darker values surrounding it. A rule of thumb that you should remember: the lightest value on the shadow side of a sphere is always darker than the darkest value on the light side. Keep the values of reflected lights under control and you'll maintain the solidity of the volume you're trying to represent. Place the highlight and the core shadow in the right place on the sphere, and everything else will fall into place. A core shadow is the darkest value on a rounded form, found next to the point on the surface where the form turns from light into shadow. The core shadow is important because it is the dark value that defines such volumes as body, head, arms, and legs in life drawing and figure painting. A cast shadow is created when an object interrupts the path of light. Its value is determined by the value of the surface it falls on, not by the object that's casting it. When you learn how to draw a simple sphere like this one, you're simultaneously learning how to draw a face, an eye, or a breast, since the principles are the same. The ovoid or egg shape is a subset of the sphere and follows the same principles. It's simply an elongated sphere. The core shadow stays in the same relative place as on the sphere, but it follows the outside contour of the form. For instance, if you look at an egg, it has a larger end and a smaller end. You wouldn't paint the core shadow in a semicircle, like on the sphere. You'd follow the outside shape of the form to create the core shadow. Turned on its end, the ovoid or egg shape is the shape of the human head. Underlying all the facial features is a basic light-dark relationship that gives the head its structural form. Doesn't take much to turn this egg into the beginning of a human head. The same is true with the lemon, which is a more symmetrical distortion of the sphere than is the egg. Its core shadow also follows the contour of the exterior of the lemon. being like neither the sphere nor the egg. The cone volume is based on the triangle and the circle. The base of the cone is rounded, like the circle, and the sides converge toward a point, like a triangle. The cone has one thing in common with the sphere. Its sides are continuous. There is no edge. The surface presented to the light receives the highlight in a long, continuous line down its entire length. The base of the cone is rounded so that it's circular in form. If we look at the base straight on, it would be a perfect circle. But what happens to the circle as it turns downward? It no longer appears as a circle. It becomes an ellipse. An ellipse is a circle seen in perspective. If the bottom of the cone is parallel to the eye level, then it appears as a horizontal line. If it's perpendicular to eye level, it appears as a perfect circle. Seen above or below eye level, the circle becomes an ellipse. The horizontal diameter of the ellipse is the same as the original circle. What changes is the height of the circle, making it an ellipse rather than a circle. When drawing volumes in the beginning, it's best to draw through the form. What I mean by that is, if I'm drawing a cone and I see the base here, it's best to go ahead and draw it all the way through. This makes you understand what's on the other side even when it isn't visible. Understanding the volume and how it looks from all sides is critical to drawing a believable image of it. Once you've established the correct dimensions, you can then erase, paint over, or ignore the lines that you've drawn through the image. In the case of the cone, you draw the ellipse by making sure that each side above and below the diameter is equally distant from the center line. Remember, perspective in circles is shown by how flat or circular the ellipses appear. If this solid cone were sitting on a surface, you'd be able to see only the front half of the ellipse. So I'm going to paint right through it. Remember that the lightest side is that position that's closest to the light source. As we move around the surface, the value is going to darken slightly, but the light's still striking this entire area. As we move toward the dark side, on the other side of this highlight area, it gets just a bit darker, and one step darker still as we're still on the light side. Once the light no longer strikes it, however, it goes into shadow immediately, and that's where we see the core shadow, is right past the cessation of light. On a smooth surface, of course, it's blended. It's not a sharp edge. But as the cone continues around to the dark side, or the back side, we begin to pick up reflected light out of the background or the ambient surroundings. And this value on the shadow side, representing the reflected light, is always darker than the darkest dark on the light side. If the cone were the open top of a champagne glass, you'd have to represent both the back side and the front side for us to understand it. And you'd see these ellipses at the top and the bottom of the glass. Unlike the circle or the sphere, the cone can be seen in perspective in linear form if the base is above or below eye level, but unless the cone form is open at its base or at the top in the case of the champagne glass, it's difficult to see what it represents by a simple line drawing. That's where knowing how to draw with mass and value can explain the object more completely. This shape is seen in its truncated form in all kinds of vessels. For instance, it's pretty obvious here in the styrofoam cup that the light side facing the light has the lightest value. We come in and pick up the core shadow just past the point where the light stops. But here on the back side, you can see clearly the reflected light, all of this indicating the roundness of this conical shape. In the little picture back here, the top portion, the green portion, is the conical shape that's similar to the shape in the styrofoam cup. And even though it's dark in value, I think you can see that it follows the same pattern of values in that the lightest value is here, closest to the light source. As it comes around toward the back side, there's the dark area where it changes from light into shadow, and then finally there's a reflected light as we go around the form. This little container is a cone that's cut off in about the middle, and we see it has the same kind of light pattern as the styrofoam cup. Lightest where it's facing the light. And here a really clear indication of the core shadow. We see it most clearly on shiny surfaces like this because this is made out of a ceramic. Again, as it goes toward the back side, we can see clearly the reflected light, but the light on this side, it's really obvious in this setup that it's nowhere near as light as any of the values on the light side of the vessel. Now, when we get to something like the conical shape top of the champagne glass, we have to ignore the light that's catching down inside and being reflected out. If you look merely at the outer surface and not the inside surface, you'll see that the lightest area is still that part that's closest to the light, and then we'll catch a dark area in through here and finally a reflected light on the right-hand side. A related volume is the cylinder, which, when reduced to a flat shape, is that of the rectangle. The cylinder has similarities to the cone and the sphere in that the sides are continuously curving toward or away from the viewer, making it have no edge on its cylindrical surface. The highlight is located on the part of the cylinder's surface that's closest to the light. The core shadow is located just beyond the point where the light side turns to the shadow side. The rounding side lightens as it moves away from the core shadow because of reflected light from the surroundings. Like the cone, The cylinder also has a circular base. It has a circular top. When we view either end straight on, we see a flat circle. But when we see it in perspective, we see ellipses at both the top and the bottom, just as we saw with the base of the cone. Perspective plays a predictable game with cylinders that you absolutely must learn if you want to paint containers, bottles, trees, arms, legs, and bodies, or even airplanes. The behavior of a cylinder in perspective is always related to eye level. Let's look at this cylinder and see what happens visually as we look down on the cylinder with the top at eye level. This line represents eye level. If we put our cylinder with the top at eye level, the top is a flat horizontal line. As the cylinder moves away from eye level, we begin to get the elliptical shape forming on the outer edge of our cylinder. As the cylinder moves farther away from the flat line, the curvature of the side gets more and more pronounced, and the ellipse that's formed becomes more and more circular. Now let's look at the cylinder with its bottom at eye level. This time, the base is a flat horizontal line. As it rises further and further above eye level, the ellipse becomes deeper and more circular. The more circular or deeper, the taller the object appears to be. In still life, very small changes in the depth of an ellipse can severely affect the perceived eye level. These forms are some of the most difficult to accurately represent in realistic painting. And this is where practice pays off in a big way. To be able to accurately draw the top and bottom of, for instance, a vase or a glass will separate the not-so-good draftsman from the really good ones. Cylindrical objects almost always exhibit different depth ellipses due to perspective, such as this comparison. The only time that the base and the top of the cylinder would be equal is if eye level were exactly halfway up the vertical length of the object, such as, let's put one where eye level is right in the middle. Then the top and bottom would have the same elliptical measurements, but in opposite directions. We just observed in the paper towel a while ago when we were looking at it. If you remember, even though we said that it formed a rectangle, a cylinder almost always exhibits this slight elliptical shape on top and bottom. So how does this knowledge help us? Well, if you're painting a tall bottle or vase, you have to make the ellipse forming the opening at the top flatter than the one at the bottom if the bottle is below eye level, as most still life setups are. On the other hand, if you're painting a silo next to a barn and there are structural rings around the silo, you'll have to make the top rings a deeper ellipse than the rings next to the ground. Otherwise, the silo will not ring true. Ellipses drawn in correct perspective, give an immediate sense of space and soaring height in landscape subjects, so much so that you have to be careful not to overstate the perspective. If you make the rings of a silo too deep, it'll make the cylinder appear to topple over. Welcome to Illuminations, a program of study designed to guide you through the basic tools one needs to become a better painter. We intend to shed light on the theories, tools, and techniques that provide this foundation. Many of the subjects we'll explore seem to confuse even experienced painters when they're trying to do everything at once. Every stroke applied to a painting must exhibit the knowledge of composition, color, value, edge, linear, and aerial perspective. That's a tall order for a beginner, yet that's exactly what many try to do when they start painting. Actually, all these concepts are simple to understand when they're studied out of the context of trying to execute a painting. Join me for the entire Illumination series for a good basic introduction to the theories, tools, methods, and techniques every painter can use. When you're in a hurry and don't have time to set up and paint, you can accomplish a great deal with a small drawing pad and a soft 2B school pencil. Drawing tools everyone has at hand. I like to use a pencil that has no wood casing and is made entirely of graphite. I can use it on its point or on its side, just like the soft charcoal. It's a bit dirtier to use this way because the graphite will get on your hands, but a wet travel tissue can be all the cleanup you need. I like a soft 6B pencil that makes really dense, dark values without pressing too hard on the paper. Cast shadows are as important to the creation of the illusion of volume as anything you put on the volume itself. If you'll notice, the feeling of the roundness at the bottom of the sphere occurs because of the depth of the cast shadow. We also know that it's rounded because this cast shadow comes all the way under the bottom. The sphere itself doesn't touch the table surface. We know because we can't see the point where it's actually sitting on the surface. So this is an important point to remember, that the cast shadow of a sphere comes all the way across the bottom, even though it's very, very slight here. As with any cast shadow from any light source, the shadow is densest and darkest right next to the object that's casting the shadow. As it moves away from the object, it gets lighter in value itself. Sometimes the cast shadow will completely disappear into another form, or it may be very highly structured with an edge, but it does get lighter as it moves away from the object that's casting the shadow. Now, you have to look at every object in a still life individually. Once you determine where everything is according to the rules, then you have to look at the object and see if it's being affected by something sitting next to it. Before I check in on those things that are next to it, I want to go ahead and put the reflected light in that I know is going to be there. There's a long piece of it down the neck. And then I'll softly blend. So far, we've used a consistent light source in all the objects we've seen. That has created a situation where we observe all the shapes and volumes under the same lighting conditions. To be fully aware of these conditions, I want to show you how I've set up the objects for demonstration. First, I constructed a stage similar to the proscenium opening that you might see if you went to a live theater production. 3 sides and a top block the light that illuminates the setup except the light from the front. Second, I turned off all the lights in the studio so that there was no ambient light falling on the setup from more than one direction. Then I chose a single spotlight to illuminate the subject. Any other light on the objects is reflected light. If you work in a studio that has north light with no supplemental artificial light, then you'll have the same effect without the need for a spotlight. If your studio has additional windows on the south, east, or west side, however, you should completely block out any light coming from those sources, so you'll be in more control of the light. How can we explain lighting situations that don't follow the classic model? If you paint from a setup that has multiple light sources, then you have to take into account all those sources and how they affect what you're seeing. For example, if I turn on all the studio lights, and we have about 12 of them in this room, then you see a marked difference in the shadow sides of the objects in the setup, even with the 3-sided box, which eliminates light from 4 directions. The result is a weakening of the volumetric forms, and the focus of the setup is no longer on just the light-dark shadow pattern, but rather on the contour of the entire setup. In this situation, the relationship between the positive, shapes, and negative spaces becomes as important and sometimes more important than the shadow patterns within the setup. If we remove the box that encloses the setup to allow light to come in from all directions simultaneously, it becomes even more confusing about lights and darks and less powerful. You'll see that the folds take on many of the simple shapes we studied earlier in the program. The cone, the cylinder, and in some cases even the side of a cube. We see the core shadows and the reflected light within these forms, just as we did on the individual volumes. Draperies are fun and challenging to do because you can take liberty with their key according to what you want to emphasize in your composition. If you want to create a strong directional movement in one direction, you create more contrast in the fold to draw the eye in that direction. If you don't want to draw the eye, for instance, out of the canvas with a continuation of a fold, then decrease the contrast in the form shadows and the eye won't be drawn to that area. Join me in future programs where we will delve more deeply into some of the subjects and ideas we've discussed today. Until then, enjoy painting and drawing.
Well, that was Drawing for Painters #2 with Johnnie Liliedahl, and you can learn more about it at lilyartvideo.com. Remember, there's a special discount code today only in the comments section. Thank you for watching.